Here is the interchange that we're going to recreate today. So the first thing that you have to think about when you're creating a synchro model is the lane geometry. So you can see here, we already have existing geometry. I'm going to move this over, and that'll help me demonstrate the more mundane functionality of the model. So these are nodes. We can move them by going up to, I believe it's here. Or, well, I use the letter M. I think the easiest way to move a node is to press the M key. We're going to move it over just so we have it referenced later. And you can always press Control Z to undo something. Just moving that over. And then we're going to kind of chop it off by introducing another node and deleting this segment. That's kind of lets us cut the interchange off. Let's do the same thing over here. First thing we're going to do, move these tails back in. All right, so in essence, we have two nodes for the interchange, right? We have, in a typical diamond interchange, we have two traffic signals. We're going to start off by creating the main road. All right, so I'm going to stop there so that there's a node there. And the same here. Yes, press the letter A, or you go up here to add link. All right. So you can see when I added a new link, it just continued what there was at the existing. So you'll find that to be true in most cases. If you have nothing, it'll just kind of show this void link. It's interesting. So for example, if I create a link here, right, suddenly there are these new approaches that have no receiving lane. So it assumes that there's no lane there. So let's start off by putting in the lanes here. So the way to open up this menu is you can double click on the actual link itself, or you can, from the node, go to lane settings, and it'll take you to this full menu. But if you want a menu that's just for what you're interested in, for example, the westbound approach or the east leg, you can press this little sub menu option. All right, so we have, in this case, you can have Google Earth pulled up on the side, or you can kind of go back and forth looking at the overlay map that's been shown for you here in Synchro. And we can see that there's one westbound lane, and then you can't really see it anymore, but there's a car blocking it, but there's a left through shared lane. So in Synchro, that looks like this. So first, I'm gonna put in one left lane, right? Because that's a exclusive left, as what they call it. I'm gonna move this node a little bit further so that we kind of get more space to play around. And as far as westbound right lanes, we do have one westbound right, but we are missing a through lane, right? So why is that? Well, the model doesn't see where a through lane could go. So once you actually create your receiving lanes on this end, you'll get an opportunity to put in your westbound lanes. So that's a shared left through. You'll also notice that it doesn't quite look like this, but let's get all of our legs in before we start shaping the geometry. Okay. We have one left, one left through, and a right. And of course, this right is channelized, a free flow channelized, because there are two lanes before the bridge, and there are three after. Okay, so that's for our westbound approach. Next, our northbound approach. So, as we can see here, we have one northbound left and two through lanes. And of course, because this is a one-way leg, we can't have any, it's not a northbound shared right, which you'll see in a second. All right, so northbound left, 2 northbound throughs, not northbound through right, because of course there's no way for that right to go. All right, let's get this a little more centered. Now that we have more lanes, we can kind of see where the geometry is truly centered. Okay, a little too far. Okay, there we go. And it looks like we've got 2 receiving lanes here. So the way we can do that, even though there's no intersection here, we can click on this western part of the leg to get the westbound through lanes. You'll notice that there are 2 sections to each link. So this section, which is, in this case would be the eastbound approach, controls the eastbound lanes, and this section controls the westbound. Because there was nothing here for it to associate with this link, it didn't assume any lanes. It just assumed the number of receiving lanes. So we can force that in there as such. Okay, we've got our northbound approach. Let's do our southbound approach. So this is a bit unique because an interchange generally has these storage lanes that serve as that later serve as turn lanes. But in Synchro, you would treat them as they are in that specific intersection with southbound through lane. So while in this case we only have 1, 2 traditional through lanes, we also have 2 additional through lane storage, but they're through storage. So how do you do that? Well, we'll talk about that when we talk about storage. Well, let's just, for the sake of building the model, put in our 4 throughs, and you notice how this is different than this. It assumes this is saying that there's no shared functionality. Okay, and then we have a southbound right lane, which if we look here, we'll see that it's a drop lane. There's no storage, so we're just gonna call it a southbound right lane. We're not gonna do anything special to it. Okay, so that obviously is not what it looks like, right? We have all of our approaches in.
So can we specify the landmark?
Yes, you can. So let's talk about that now. So starting here, where it's a little more straightforward, let's move this over. We can see that there is, in essence, a left turn storage. So this single lane tapers off. If you were to interpret the center lane as the main lane, tapers off. So create a left turn lane and move it up to a right turn lane. So the way that we show that is we click on the link, just as we did to add the lanes. This, however, is lane settings for greater detail and tapers. Why not you have to go to a different lane? But here you can add in your storage. So I'm gonna guesstimate that this is about 200 feet. Looks like it's a little bit more than that, 300. That's pretty close. You also notice that there's a taper, but this taper is not the taper that is being used. Obviously, the taper being used is much greater.
Nice thing is, something like paper isn't really gonna come in.
Yeah.
It's more of a visual thing. You want, to look nice, usable, but if the taper isn't accurate, it's not gonna change the analysis.
Yeah, and I believe the storage as well, for the purpose of capacity analysis, storage doesn't actually matter all that much. It's more for simulation where taper and storage come into play. So it's more for our own aesthetic, so that we know that what we're looking at is accurate, that we put in that extra level of detail. And maybe someday in the future we will run simulation, and that would be nice to have already done. So we put in 1 storage lane there, and then this also we're going to say is a storage lane, which I'm going to assume is the same amount. All right, so obviously the taper here is a little bit more aggressive than what is truly there. So let's add in some more generous taper. Okay, so we go to this menu here, simulation setting. Yeah. Simulation setting, that's where we can add in that greater level of taper. So we have it currently set to 100, which is pretty generous, but this is a fairly high-speed facility. ADOT probably had a lot of room to work with, so they put in a little bit more taper than is perhaps. No. You can measure it. So in this case, I just use my best judgment to determine that length. But storage length, especially for ADOT, is based on specific criteria that they specify in their DGP. Or sometimes it's just what they have available.
For modeling an existing intersection, we would look at Google Earth. cool out after. And generally, we would round the nearest 5 feet because the greater level was, so don't stress over one or two. But if you're modeling something in the future, you would use the design standards in terms of what was required, or make an assumption using all those that's needed. But
A question?
So I think I noticed it. So we don't need to conflict area or to.
No, you wouldn't have that. I think that is mostly assumed. We can actually show the conflicts by turning on the intersection paths. So it's in options, map settings, intersection paths, and that sort of demonstrates the conflict areas. But I don't believe that's something that we ever have to specify.
If you do a simulation, like if you go to the next level beyond this, those will come into play for basic capacity analysis, not going to account for that lane pattern. It's not going to go that level. Can we do a good modeling for the place off sign, leader sign? Absolutely, yes. We focuses on single organization. That's kind of where they put most of their tools, but it actually can do roundabouts, hallway stops, do a stop. We can show you. Because I think we can show a example of a lot of yeah, it's very difficult for you to see people that are very complex.
Yeah.
That is something I found with Synchro, is to be able to do a roundabout, you do have to stop. It only has so many settings. So you would specify a 1 or a 2 lane roundabout, but it has to apply the whole thing. You can't say 2 lanes for the northbound, but 1 lane for the southbound. You can add exclusive lanes. So just like we'll see with signalized intersections where you do have to simplify something, with roundabouts you have to simplify more. But it is still useful, especially for comparing. You know, if you're comparing 2 options, then you're simplifying the same things.
And there's another program that I believe, Bill, you're fairly knowledgeable in it at ADOT finds acceptable. Is that right?
It's a great way to do roundabout. That's a program folks who solely roundabouts. And you can really get into that detail of this approach has so many lanes, they're this wide, by approach angles, the throat openings, all of that can be specified. But if you really want to get the detail roundabout how we use my road out. And so how am I happy in a low at
Okay. So it's another little addition of detail that you can add in for channelized lights, and that would be the curb radii. So in this case, we have free flow channelized, right? We could get out our measurement tool with Google Earth, but I did that in advance to save a little bit of time. And I found the radius for this channelized right to be 150 feet. So the way that you would enter that in is you open up your simulation settings. Notice, no, sorry, not simulation settings. You would go to lane settings. Yes, lane settings. And then here there is an option for curve radius for channelized right turns at intersection. In this case, we'll make it 150. You'll notice it kind of pops out. So yeah, so that's nice. Something that I did want to touch on, notice these little purple boxes. These are detectors. So if you're familiar with like actuation at intersections, those little inductive loops, I'm sure you're all familiar with them. It's not critical to the analysis, but if you don't have them, it will mess up. So it's something that you don't necessarily have to play with, but you need it for your intersection to work because actuation depends on it. Otherwise, it would never open. I have had that happen where I had a project that for whatever reason was getting 3,000 seconds delay. It turns out it didn't have detectors. So
go ahead and show them how you choose the single type actuator.
Ah, yes. Okay, so if you click on the node, let me turn the node number back on. Notice there's a control type. So here you can specify what kind of control that the intersection experiences. So the three top ones are probably the most common, which is actuated uncoordinated, semi-actuated uncoordinated, actuated coordinated. Actuated coordinated is kind of like the most sophisticated. It's both receives actuation from a detector or a camera, and it's coordinated on a larger system. But because we're at an interchange, we're going to assume that this is it's actuated uncoordinated. Right?
I would check with the, I think this is actually, I think Verado is coordinated. It's just they.
I see, that's right, but it would still be coordinated even though you can't use HCM6. Okay,
Right.
I forget.
It just allows you to set maps.
And the way to, sometimes you just know based on the context of the intersection, but you can look in Street View and see, like, are there like antennas essentially on the intersections that are used to communicate between them. The alternative to antennas is fiber optics, expensive to run, but that's how you would know.
Or you can always just ask the agency in charge.
Yeah, and as far as like capacity analysis, actuated coordinated unit are your best friend when it comes to global service. Okay.
Default, you don't do that yourself, so it's just set by default to coordinated or.
So you can set your default to whatever you would like as far as intersections go. I believe the default is pre-timed, which is just like there's a clock and it runs. That's it. There's no triggers, very simple. There's a pre-timed intersection in Kentucky that has like a 5-minute red. So,
in rural areas, because it's a lot of free time, because it's just simpler and they don't have to put it in structure. Especially if you've got, a rural interstate where you want that two volume to get a lot of green time. 2 minutes of green time and then 15 seconds of opposing traffic. You can just set it, and most of the time it works really well. It avoids that infrastructure. Inside a municipal area, you're going to see coordination, a lot more often.
Something interesting is that I believe the city of Glendale has intersections that operate flashing yellow at certain times of day. We've also in the city of Phoenix. So if your traffic signal is only really for your peak hour, you can put in that thought in a pre-timed scheme and then use something else throughout the rest of the day. Actuated coordinated is just like the most instantaneous adjustment. Okay. Let's talk about storage at interchanges. So ordinarily, when you have a left turn lane, that is when you would get the option to add in storage. And you'll even notice here that the storage length isn't really an option for southbound through. So how do you deal with that? Sometimes you can add in a lane and then take it away. But I've also found that by just adding in storage length, you're given the option of storage. So in this case, we had 2 lanes, right, that were being used for storage, and then bam, happens just like that. So it's not really a turn lane, right? It's not actually for the southbound left lane, but it's assuming that this instruction is for the southbound. And let's just guesstimate. Yeah, that looks about right. That looks like our section. Oh, good. You could also, so these nodes, they can be moved by hand, or you can specify their coordinates, relative to some meridian that you have established in the model. You will notice though that if you draw a straight line and say, for example, let's make this, let's leave that as such, and let's make the X the same as the X up here, so that they're theoretically, it should be perfectly straight, right? I don't think it's big enough for you to notice, but because of the curvature of the Earth, an X coordinate is not going to be perfectly straight. It'll throw it a little bit jagged. So Synchro does allow you that level of detail. Question.
Exactly.
So our southbound right in this case is a drop lane. So there is technically no storage, right? If a lane isn't being set aside for storage, it's not truly a storage lane. So there's not really any storage that we could assign to that. And you'll notice that the curb aligns with our intersection. In fact, it looks like this lane is a bit wider, which would, or rather the median is a bit wider. Oh, seems to have disappointed. Okay. Let's go. So how do we adjust the median width? Click on this link. Generally under simulation settings, you can find things like median width. And let's make this 16. It looks like our median is a bit wider in this case.
And again, this is something that isn't really going to affect your capacity analysis, but will come into play if you do making sure that your lanes align, and for things like the length that a left-turn vehicle has to cross, your median width will matter. The left-turn vehicles have more area to cross. So, yeah, exactly. It helps, you know, to put it in early on so you don't forget. But for simple analysis.
Okay, so we have our signalized intersection. I believe there's nothing more that can be done at this intersection. But notice how there are 4 lanes, right, being received by 3 lanes. So something is obviously wrong here, right? Well, we haven't put in our other intersection quite yet. Notice how there's a color associated with these node numbers. The white nodes are actually nodes that are going to be studied because they are intersections. The other nodes that are showed in blue are not study intersections because there's no true intersection. Once we add in that intersection, the conflict, it becomes white and becomes a part of our study. So let's go ahead and add in, on the bridge, we have 2 southbound lefts, right? And we have 2 southbound throughs, which nicely come to line up with our 4 approach lanes. In this case, we have 2 eastbound lefts and an eastbound right. There's no eastbound through, interestingly enough, which is uncommon for a diamond. Generally, you'll see that at more complex interchanges like spoobies, where through movements are discouraged for efficiency. But in this case, in a fairly undeveloped area, the benefit to that is probably to discourage basically people cheating traffic by using the frontages. You know, if there's congestion here, your GPS might tell you to get off and get back on for some, you know, minute time advantage. So that's probably why that's the case. Let's do the same here. We'll put in our intersection. Let's assume 300. That's fine. Let's assume also 300. There's 1 lane. Okay. Okay, that looks nicer. I believe this is also somewhat channelized under lane settings. Right turn channelized. This is also a free flow, and the radius is probably somewhere on that.
For the channelized right turns, you'll have options to say whether it's free flow, designalized, yield, or no stop. Most of the time, when you're channelized free flow, you specify. But if it doesn't go into a tunnel, you'll want to specify the stop control for more often. It's going into a shared lane, turning traffic to you, and yield. And like you were seeing there, it pops up on the screen with either a stop sign or a yard sign. And I think when you do signalize, it even pops up.
Yeah, there's a little the signal head somewhere, and then this is the detector.
Yeah, it's hard to see. Yeah, detector.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Yeah, that is it.
And Bill will go in length about that in the signal timing portion of this. Okay, so we have our southbound throughs, we have our on ramp. So let's do our northbound approach. So here we can see only 1 through or dedicated through lane for the interchange, and the same situation for the northbound and northbound route. So we have a little simpler number of like we don't have okay. There we go. 3 northbound throughs and a right turn lane. Okay, so got 3 lanes that become a northbound left and 2 throughs. Okay, very good. And see nothing wrong with this. Notice how this median is 24 feet because we specify that there are 2 southbound left lanes. It is assumed generally that the left lanes are in the median. So Synchro will automatically update the median width on the outside of the intersection to what it assumes is your median based on number of lanes. Okay. I believe that is all for geometry wise. I didn't mention how to label the street name. So this is Verado Way. Verado Way. And when you do that, you can, if you do it before you put in the intersection, which is what would have been smart, it'll maintain that across the entire link. But because I've already broken up the link, it's not going to assume that. And then we can call this I-10 off ramp or I-10 eastbound off ramp. Okay.
Yeah, with interchanges like this where there's a diamond, to intersection, you just specify eastbound. You get the node 21 there, all the traffic from the freeway on that is going to be westbound traffic, either westbound on ramp or westbound off. And similarly, the next one is all eastbound.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so I should just leave this as I-10 westbound, and then that way I can name this. And let's do that here also.
The only exception to this is sometimes intersections will have kind of like a compass style off ramp where you've got, you know, a long curved off ramp and you may actually have traffic from the other direction come in. Those aren't common, so, but if you do see those, you know, you can make the variation. Yeah, and I'll talk briefly about the different, yeah, exactly, something like that.
Yeah, that's weird where you have the same approach in both directions. Why? Who knows?
Just increases.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a semi-program. Yeah. So I'll go over briefly some other types interchanges, but yeah, the most common you're gonna see is.
Okay. Bill, would you like me to cluster them for you, or do you want to do that?
I'll do that.
Okay, I think that's all. Any questions on geometry? No.
So you done, the merging one?
Yes.
Yeah. Able to.
Yes. Yeah. And there are actually templates that Synchro provides that you can refer to. We actually modeled the that interchange. I'm familiar with it because right below there's the Happy Valley DDI, which is a complex DDI, which is already a complex system because it has frontage access. So Synchro is capable of a lot of things.
That's what some that you guys,
Mhm.
they figured it out.
Yeah, it's a little. I mean, it remains to be seen if it'll actually work long, but it's pretty cool.
I don't know what the story is like. Building the front.
Yeah. I think the big issue with those is just gonna be driver education too. Once more people get more familiar, then they can reduce the signage, and it's gonna get more usable. Right now, because people are so new to it, the signage that you have to have there is excessive, I think. We'll get there. All right, so let's talk about the actual signal timing on here. Well, before that, I guess let me talk about a couple different types of intersection so that we know what we're looking at and how the signal timing will apply to this. So we're looking at a diamond interchange because these are definitely the most common type of interchange you'll see. But there's also a single point urban interchange. That's what you would have seen at 101 in the Shea here. We're not talking about that because those really analyze like a single interchange. They're pretty straightforward. They're not going to have the through movements, but otherwise they operate as a single intersection. You can have things like the example we showed you where there's that half trumpet, the half clover leaf. Those are going to be very customized, and they're going to start with the basis of what we have here. You're going to go from there. Same with the diverging diamond. You're kind of start with the basis of what we have here, and then you're going to customize. So we're going to look at just a standard diamond. It's kind of the basic, and it's most of what you see. So we talked about the signal type, right? Where we talked about actuated coordinates. So if we look at these options here, you've got pre-timed, uncoordinated, semi-actuated, uncoordinated, actuated, coordinated. The big difference that coordination versus uncoordination gives you is it lets you set the offset from a reference. So imagine you've got a road with 10 signals along there, and you're driving along that road. If you want to catch every green, they can't all start turning green at the same time, then turn red at the same time. You want to offset when they turn green such that it's going to work with the speed of prevailing traffic, right? So that allows us to set this offset here. That coordination is different from what's called clustering. And clustering is what we're going to talk about here. So I'm going to go over to the existing one here to show you, because it's already set up. If we look at the timing on here, you're going to see these little pink boxes. That's your telltale that something's clustered, because it's going to behave differently. If we look at the signal timing on this one, we haven't clustered it yet. You see there's no pink boxes. So that's kind of how you know whether something's clustered or not, is to look at those on the timing page. Look for those pink boxes there. So how do we cluster them? You want to make sure that they're the same signal type. So let me switch this guy to actuated coordinated as well. And you're going to want them to have the same cycle. I think it'll actually change it to be the same if it's not already, but always better to have it the same from the get-go. So they're both 45 right now, and we'll update that once we look at the timing sheets. But we've got something here called cluster editor. We'll go in there, and it gives you a little mini map, which is kind of nice. And then you just select which ones you want clustered. It gives you a list here, and you hit OK. So now we know these are clustered. You could theoretically cluster several intersections, and maybe in like a downtown area, that could be really useful. You can come up with scenarios where that might be useful, but we're usually just going to have the two. So now when we look at the timing, you see we've got these pink boxes. Now, none of this timing is right, of course. What Synchro is going to do when you build an intersection is it's going to come up with something that works and use that as its assumption, so that you can run an analysis. I could run an analysis right now if I plugged in volumes, and it's not going to run into an error. It's always going to come up with something that works. And so all we have to do is take the elements that are relevant and update those from the default to what they are, or what we want them to be in our model, either what's in the real world or what we're considering in the future. So let's start by looking at the timing sheets, because that's where we're going to get that info from. So let me pull that up and start sharing that screen. Here we go. Okay. So when you request signal timing from ADOT, or they provide it to you for whatever reason, you're usually going to get two things. You're going to get a diagram. Ideally, you get this. If you don't, ask them for it. Sometimes they don't always volunteer it. But you'll get a diagram, and you can see the north arrow there. So this is our north intersection. And it's going to tell you which phases are each movement. And if you're familiar with NEMA phasing, it's going to match that roughly. But their numbering might not always be what you want. So for NEMA phasing, we prefer to have our left turns be odds and our throughs be evens. There's the 7-11 rule, where it should always add up to one of those two. The numbering they have isn't always going to follow that rule. So you've got two options. You can either keep their numbering 100% and just know that it's not going to follow that rule. It might look a little weird for what you're used to. Or you can essentially translate their numbering. If you were doing a non-interchange, if it was just a single intersection, I'd translate the numbering every time because it's simple to do. In this case, translating the numbering can be a little more confusing because you've got multiple phases that'll have the same movement. So for this example, we're not going to translate the numbering. We're just going to keep the numbering that they have, even though we've got even numbers that do left turns. And that is jarring to me, at least, and probably to some of you, but just for simplicity's sake, we'll keep it that way for now. So this kind of tells us what approaches are going to have which phases, and we'll reference this again in a moment. But there's another document that they'll give you, and that is the actual timing sheet. So let me share that. Now, I'm convinced that the agencies are resentful anytime you ask for signal timing. And as a result of that, they give you 46 pages of tables. No, this is an output from their controller, most likely. And so it's in a language that their controller can read. The controller is the actual box there at the intersection. And it needs all this data in whatever format it can read. We are not machines, we are humans, but we'll do our best to read it anyways. So the trick I've found with these is to start at the back, because that's where your big picture information is going to be. And then as you get closer to the front of the document, you're going to get to more of your fine detailed information. So I scroll back to the back. And let's zoom in on it. There's also going to be a lot of information in here we do not need. So half of this is spotting the information you need and disregarding the stuff you don't need. The other half is knowing what to do with the stuff you need. So pedestrian detector phases. Those are great. I'm glad that they have those. We don't need. Because, well, we do have pedestrian detectors in Synchro, and if you really want to get the fine detail, you can put it in there. It's generally not going to have any impact on your analysis. And like I said before, modeling is about answering the question you need answered. Playing with detector phasing, almost never going to answer that question, unless you're trying to design detectors, in which case, yeah, you can put it in there. Synchro can do that, but for most of what you need to do, it's not going to be helpful. Again, this is more detector information. And you'll notice this is common terminology they'll have is plan numbers. So this is detector plan 1. There might be, some intersections might have, 15 detector plans, and they use a different detector plan for different times of the year or something. This one, it's got a single detector plan. And so it's just going to use that all the time. That's fine. But we don't need the detector info. Let's keep going. Detector plan 1, more info about that. Detector plan 1, more info about that. Again, not useful for what we're doing. Now we've got action numbers. Again, this is something where they're going to have different plans, or in this case, different actions, and they number them. And different ones are going to come up for different scenarios. Again, this is something a computer is designed to read. It's got 100 action plans, and they're all preloaded, and most of them are empty because they don't actually use that many, but it has to list them all so the computer knows that there isn't anything in them. If any of you guys have done programming at all, you kind of understand you have to define your variables, even if you're, even just to say that that variable is a 0. So we've got a bunch of variables that are zeros. And this is great because now we're getting through the pages of the document. We've got less we have to deal with. I'm just looking at the values in here. I'm seeing that it's empty, so I know I don't. As soon as we get to one that's not, which I'm guessing is going to be around action 4, probably going to start actually seeing something useful. It's not 4. Yeah, so they don't use action plans. That's what we've discovered today. And sometimes that happens. So action plans are one way that they can kind of control what happens at the intersection, but that doesn't mean they have to use them. So they apparently don't use action plans. Great. Here's their table describing when they would use each action plan. And they're all the same. So they don't use any of their action plans. That's fine. All right, day plans. This is another way where they can specify what's happening at different times. And so we've got 9 different day plans. Let's get up to the top and let's see. Aha. So now we're seeing that they do use, looks like day plan 1 and day plan 2. Probably what this is weekdays and weekends, is my guess. And that's just based off of experience. And what you're seeing here, events, that's going to be your time of day. So event 1 is probably your AM peak hour. We'll verify this. And during your AM peak hour, they want you to run action 100. Okay. And you can see the hour, that's 00. So that starts at midnight. Midnight, they start running this AM plan. So that's going to run through your AM peak hour. Event 2, they run action 5, and that's going to be 1500 hours. So that's 3 p.m. So this is what you're going to see for your evening peak hour. And so it's going to run this action. And then at 1800, so 6 p.m., this is the end of our evening peak hour, it goes back to action plan 100. So essentially, we've just got these 2 different plans that we're gonna have to account for. One of them during our AM peak hour, one of them during our PM peak hour. You're usually not gonna need to look at a weekend. Sometimes you will, depending on the reason for your model, depends on the question you're trying to answer. So if you do need that information, it'll be there. So let's figure out what these actual timings are going to be. So this is good. This tells us we know there are these two scenarios we're going to look at, and then it's day plan 1. All right. So here's some more information about when each day plan applies. We never use 9, never use 8, never use 7, never use 6, never use 5, 4, 3, 2. When do we use day plan 2? Saturdays and Sundays. During every month, during every day of the month, but only on Saturdays and Sundays, which is kind of what I expected. And day plan 1, we'll use it every month of the year, every day of the month, Mondays through Fridays. Great. You will sometimes see, especially around universities, there will be separate ones for school in session, school not in session. You'll see certain days of the month, maybe they'll do something different, or even certain days of the year. Tempe is big on that. They have specific timing for certain football games, for 4th of July, for certain events. They've got specified timing for all that, and that would be in a table similar to this. Let's see. That's not useful. Pedestrian omission, we don't need that. We don't need this. We don't need any of that. This is preemption. Preemption is great when you've got it in your signal. This is so that typically it's going to be emergency vehicles. You can do preemption for buses as well, or really anything you wanted to, but typically you see it for those. We don't usually model for that because it's not the typical thing that's going to happen. Most of the time we're modeling for what is going to happen during a standard cycle, and the preemption is essentially just violating the design. So it's information that the controller needs, it's not information we need. Again, preemption settings, lots of different ones. More preemption settings. Similar, they've got different preemptions, similar to how there's different action plans. It looks like they probably only use one of them, but we don't need to worry about it. Phase splits. Okay, so now we've got different pattern numbers, different split numbers, and then various information about them. Coordination phases and phase splits. This is starting to get into useful information. Now, pattern 106, we're not using. So everything's blank, but at least we're in a table that looks like it could contain information. So I'm going to check 100 because it said it used action 100. So I'm curious, did they mean this 100? It's all zeros. They didn't mean this one. Okay. So we keep going. I'm also going to check, I think it was 15 that they said, but no, this is all zeros. So this is a table they don't use. All right, so we're going to ignore it. Coordination options. That, again, is also getting into information that could be useful for us. But it looks like this particular coordination option, not information we need. So we're going to move past that. Phase recalls. So this is getting into information that could be useful. Things like vehicle detectors, which phases have vehicle detectors, and what the recalls are. But it looks like this is for a scenario that they're not using. It's not fully filled out. So it's good to know that that's there, but I don't think we're going to need that table. Pre-time phases, they're not doing pre-timing here, so that's blank. Dual entry, that's another piece of information that we could use. So that tells us what phases would have that dual entry if this table ends up being an actual table. Overlap phases, but not using those. They letter these ones for some reason. They've got different overlap ones. Instead of numbering them, they letter them, but it doesn't look like they use any of them. Oh, here we go. So they do use some overlap phases. We shouldn't need to include that in our model, but if we find that we do, then we know where that's at. Sometimes it's even helpful with these large documents to take notes about, oh, this was on this page, this was on page 9. Yes, you need to come back to it. But for the most part, we're not going to need that. Now we're getting into useful information controller timing data. So if you look at these categories on the left, most of these are going to be useful categories. So interestingly, this doesn't specify any kind of time of day plan. that it's referring to. So this is probably a default. This is probably what would default if for whatever reason the controller wasn't told what time of day plan to use. And so we can use this as a default as well. If for whatever reason their timing sheets don't tell us anything about that time of day, action 100, then we know to use these. That's what we'll default to. I'm hoping that they give us more detail, but if they don't, this should have all the information we need. Okay. If then statements are certain logic that they can do here, but it doesn't look like they're using any of it, so we're going to disregard it as well. And there's different statements. Again, this is designed for a computer, so it needs all of these variables defined, even if they're not being used. So we're going to skip them, which is good. We're eating through pages, narrowing it down to the important stuff. All right, we've got overlay delay. We don't need that. Okay. Flash entry and flash exit. We shouldn't need that. Overlap phases. Okay, startup options. This essentially is just telling the system what to do whenever it's starting up. So if for whatever reason it lost power and it starts back up, or just when they first installed it. We don't need that. We don't need any of this. Phase in use. We don't need that. This is just saying that they use those 6 phases. Sequencing. This can be useful. So you guys are familiar with the ring and barrier that specifies which phases can happen at the same time. So you can have phases on different rings happening at the same time, but not across different barriers. So this tells us that instead of doing, yeah, no, go ahead.
So when you say different barrier, you can't have conflict. You can have the same phases at the same time, but conflict.
Right. And the software will let you put in conflicts. It'll just call them out as conflicts. So you have to be aware when you're doing it to put it in the correct way, because it, it's kind of a sandbox for us. We can put whatever we want into the software, and we could create conflicts in the software. So we have to know not to do that. And the way we do that is by putting conflicting things on different sides of the barrier. And I'll show you when we get into the actual Synchro sheet, kind of what that looks like in Synchro. But the important thing is that things on the same barrier, within the same barrier, can happen at the same time. So here we've got 1, 2, 5, and 6 are all on the same side of the barrier. So 1 and 2 can't happen at the same time as each other because they're within the same ring, right? So 1 ends and then 2 starts. But 1 could happen at the same time as 5 or as 6. I'll zoom in on this. 1 could happen at the same time as 5 or 6, and 2 could happen at the same time as 5 or 6. But 5 and 6 can't happen at the same time. 1 and 2 can't happen at the same time. And now we've got a barrier. So now none of these can happen at the same time as any of these 4. Let me actually grab my highlighter. Well, the highlighter might not be a fan of this PDF. It doesn't like the highlighter. That's okay. We won't have. But yeah, these 4 are part of one barrier. These 4 are part of the next barrier. So 3 can happen at the same time as 7 or 8. 4 can happen at the same time as 7 or 8. And likewise, 7 can happen at the same time as 3 or 4. But none of these will ever happen at the same time as these because they're on opposite barriers. It does go all the way out to 16. You're almost never going to use anything past 8. NEMA phasing really only goes out to 8. Sometimes you will see this in an urban area where you've got something like a train, like the light rail crossing, or an all pedestrian phase, some kind of hold phase that just lets all pedestrians go. You might see these get used there, or along Grand Ave where you've got 6 approaches. You're gonna see more of these. And in fact, I think they go into multiple rings there. But 99% of what you do, you're gonna see these 8 phases in two rings, 2 barriers, splits it into those quadrants. And that's what we're going to look at when we look at it in Synchro as well. So that's useful information there. Controller information, we're at the top. This is just to know which intersection we're talking about. Okay, so what this tells me is that one page we found has everything we need to know for this signal timing. So this guy here, this controller timing data, that's everything we need to know. And we'll go through kind of each item line by line as we enter it in. So how do I print this? That's all. So let's go back to our Synchro and we'll kind of look at, I'm just going to share the screen so I can put it back and forth. That'll be easier. Okay, so you guys can see Synchro, and then we can see that guy. Did it go over? It did not. I failed at sharing. Oh, it's just live. Okay, good. I didn't fail at sharing. So we can go to that screen, and we can go to the screen. Yeah, almost. We can go to this screen as necessary. Okay. So let's start by getting just some data in here, and then we'll flush it out and get in more detail as we go. Okay, so we're looking at the westbound intersection here, Verado and I-10 westbound. Because these are clustered, changes we make to one are going to affect the other. And we can switch, we can kind of toggle between them. If you hit F8 on your keyboard, it gives you the option to switch between them. So this one, of course, because we duplicated, we get two of the same name, but let's see, blank zone. No, they're still both in the blank zone. So let's give these guys a zone. This is something you can do. You can create zones. Helps if you spell things correctly. On the same information tab, you just double click on your node. This is the same tab where you can set your control type, your cycle length, and you can set the node location with your coordinates. You can also create a zone. So if you want to just analyze a specific zone, you can do that. So we're going to call this training. And the benefit of that is now I can just narrow my scope down to training, and it makes it a little easier to toggle between these two. Oh, so these are the cutoff nodes at the end. What are these? Well, either way, F8 will let us go between. So if we're looking here, we can move to eastbound, and then that is our other intersection, and we can move to westbound. The other option is just go back to the map view, click on the next guy, and open it up. Or this is kind of interesting, you can actually use these arrows to go in between them. So our eastbound one is on the south leg, so you can click your northbound arrow, and it actually bumps you up to the next one, and you can go back and forth, which is kind of fun. Anyways.
Hey Bill, isn't the timing that you see in the space diagram, that's true for both of the intersections if they're clustered, right?
It is, yeah. I like looking at the phasing settings here. This shows all the phases that are currently available, and these phases are the same phases for each intersection. So it shows different ones as being the clustered ones because it's identifying which ones are associated with the other intersection, but it's still the same 4 phases. You know, we're gonna have more once we're done it. But yeah, it'll show them all there. And sometimes it is easier to input your data, having everything in phase order, like it shows here, 2, 4, 6, 8. And sometimes it's easier to put it into this timing sheet where it's by approach, east, west, north, south. It's kind of a preference. And I'll kind of go back and forth between the two of them depending on what I want. The first thing I want to do is make sure that we've got the correct phases for each movement, right? Because that's how we're then going to assign the timing. So let's look at this guy here. And we're looking at this intersection first, and then we'll go to this intersection second to kind of tie in it. So we know that we need 1, 3, 2, and 4 here. So our southbound through is going to be 1. So we'll go back to Synchro, and we'll say southbound through, you need to be 1. And our southbound right is going to be a permitted 1. That's something that you have to specify is protected phases versus permitted phases. because in the real world there, that southbound right doesn't have its own phase. It doesn't have its own signal head. It's going to just be whenever the southbound through can happen, southbound right can happen. If it had its own phasing, where the southbound through couldn't happen, but the southbound right could, which sometimes you'll see with channelized or what's called an overlap phase, then it might get its own protected number. In this case, they're the same. So we'll put 1 in there. Now our northbound through is 1, 2, and 4. This is something you really only see at these interchanges, where you're going to have multiple phases for the same approach. It's kind of a peculiarity of it, but it's something that we can do here in Synchro. So you'll just do 1 space 2 space 4, and you click away. And so now it's saying, hey, there's a conflict. These are lighting up red because it's noticing a conflict. We're going to resolve that, but just so you know, and it even calls out conflict here. It does let you program conflicts, and then we just have to resolve them before we know that we're done. And that's okay. You'll get conflicts before you get everything entered. Our northbound left is going to be 2 and 4. So we'll do that. Northbound left. And these are going to be protected phases, as I understand it. It's possible that one of those is a permitted and the other one's protected. But I think they're both protected phases.
That legend, they were in the center of the interchange, protected left is, right, you see that?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, it's saying where it's got a solid arrow is a protected movement. So it looks like it's saying that all of our left turns are protected. It would probably have a hollow arrow for permitted ones. It's just this intersection doesn't happen to have one. But yeah, that's a good point. So this is all going to be protected movements. And that's something you'll want to know when you do kind of your review of the site to get information. You can look from the street view and you can see what kind of arrowheads it has. I suppose I should speed up, huh? All right, so we're gonna. No, you're absolutely right though. Our northbound left, we're gonna have protected, so we'll delete that 0. We're gonna have protected 2 and 4. It doesn't like having nothing there, so since I deleted it before I put the protected in, it autofilled it, but now it'll let me delete it. Okay, and you'll see this changes to protected here for the turn type. You can also change it here and say, oh no, make them permitted. There's various options you can have there. I won't go into all of them right now because for the most part, they're not relevant, but permitted and protected are the two that you'll use the most. In this case, we're gonna use protect. So now our westbound approach, these are all 3, because that's what they told us it is. So you notice the conflict goes away, which is great. So now there's nothing conflicting, but we have to make sure that it's logical, that it actually matches what we expected, right? So let's look at our barrier settings that we had. I've gone and forgotten where we put the barrier setting. I hope I'm going the right way. Let's see. Here we go. So we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Pretty simple. So here we can actually look at our ring and barrier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That's pretty standard, and we're in alignment with that. So what that means, when we look here, this solid line is going to represent your barriers. And then your rows here are going to represent your rings. So we've got 1 and 2, and then 5 and 6 would be here, but there is no 5 that's being used. We've got 3 and 4, and then 7 and 8 are going to be down here. 7 and 8 aren't being used. Okay, so that's what we would expect to see. In fact, 6 is only used on the other intersection, and we're going to get rid of it once we put those in. So you'll see that go away as well, which is great. So now we want to kind of make sure that everything looks logical, looks reasonable. Phase 1, so this is going through time. We're starting at the beginning of our cycle and going through the cycle. Even though it does a conflict check for you, we still want to go through and make sure everything looks reasonable. So these are north and our south happening at the same time. That's reasonable. And then it switches over so that our northbound through and our northbound left are happening, and the other intersections northbound through is happening. That's reasonable. And then it's going to switch over so that our westbound through and right is happening. Nothing else is happening at the same time. And that makes sense because you've got a left turn. You can't, and you and a through really, you can't have either of your north-south happening there. And then it switches over to having the northbound through and the northbound left again, but our other intersection has its eastbound phase happening at that time. That makes sense. So that's all logic. Okay, so let's move over to that other intersection and set our phases here as well. And then things will start to look a little neater. So for this intersection now, our northbound through is going to be 5. That's pretty simple. So we'll set that. Our northbound through is going to be 5 and 5. Okay. Our westbound is going to be 4, and I think that's already set conveniently enough. So let's look, or excuse me, our eastbound, I should say, is 4, and it's calling them both permitted. I'm going to switch them to protected. In this case, it's not actually going to change anything. It's just meter. Okay. And then our southbound, we've got 3, 5, and 6 for our through, 3, 6 for our left. So 3, 5, 6 for our through, 3 space 5 space 6, and then this was 3 and 6 for our left, wasn't it? 3 and 6, I believe. Let's double check. There we go. All right. So, but those are protected, not permitted. Those there, and we'll delete. And you can see when you've got something that doesn't make sense, this little thing here will go to custom, because it'll say, that's something special. I don't recognize that. When you've got something sensible, it'll usually pick something. Okay. So we do end up using 6, which is great. All right. So now we can bounce back and forth between our intersections, and you can see the timing is the same. It's the same timing that controls both. We've just got movements for either intersection listed with each phase, right? And we've got no conflicts for either. So now we can actually start entering some data. Okay, great. Let's go to our data sheet. And let's do that a little bit. Let's go here. This is basically all the data you're going to need. And based off the format of this, let's do a side-by-side. If I can. Synchro is not good at kind of doing a side-by-side with other programs. Assuming you guys are using Windows for most things, it might be different in Mac, but it struggles sharing the screen. That's we'll adapt to Synchro, I suppose. There we go. Let's give Synchro as much room as we can. Put that over and spread that over. Great. Okay, so now we can go just into our phase settings and just start going by the numbers. So the first thing we're going to look at is minimum green. That's going to correspond to our minimum initial. That's just telling you what's the least amount of green time I'm going to allow based on my actuation. And these numbers are usually pretty low. The default is 5. But we're going to go 2, 3, 4, 8, and 6. Great. And this is kind of a hint that they're not using 7 or 8 here, is those values go back to the default. So even though they say they could use 7 or 8, we know they're not using them because they haven't actually input most of the useful data for phase 7 or 8. And that matches what we're seeing. There is no 7 or 8. That's a lot of what this game is looking and seeing, well, does this look reasonable? Is this meeting my expectations, basically? All right, so bike minimum green, we don't use that. We're not using that one. Delay green, we're not using that one. Walk time. Okay. Walk time is 7 seconds. And it looks like 2 and 6 do not have walk phase. So we're going to go through and we're just going to uncheck the walk phase for 2 and 6. This makes sense because those have left turning movements. You usually aren't going to have a walk phase when there's left turns. So we get rid of those. And we end up with 4 walk phases. There's 4 legs of the intersection. So that's reasonable. That's 7. Ped clear. Now, ped clear is interesting. Depending on the jurisdiction you're dealing with, this ped clear could mean, could include your walk time or not. Generally, it's going to include that walk time, and it can overlap your yellow things. So this is essentially the number of seconds it would take for someone to cross that walk. So you need to make sure that your walk time and your flash don't walk time total up to be this ped clear time. Now, in some jurisdictions, when they say ped clear, they mean flash don't walk, or they call it ped clear. So in that case, your values are just going to match that exactly. In this case, it should be that the sum of my walk time and flash don't walk adds up to that ped clear. It's honestly not going to make a big difference in your analysis. The key is to be consistent throughout. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that the flash don't walk plus my walk time adds up to that ped clear. And I'm not going to exclude my yellow time. This is kind of just a decision you have to make ahead of time about how I'm going to interpret this data. If these numbers were massive, if I was seeing 35, 45, very large values, that would indicate to me they must be including their yellow time here. They must be including their walk time. With values of this size, they may not be including their walk time in there. But my experience with ADOT is they usually are. So I'm just going to say, we're going to have 2 seconds of flash don't walk on that guy. We're going to have 10 seconds on that guy. We're going to have, what is that? 6 seconds. We're going to have 15 seconds. And so that's just a matter of me taking this value here, that 22, subtracting my 7, and that gives me 15. Now, Synchro will not allow flash don't walk to happen at the same time as yellow time. So if you know that in the real world that flash don't walk is happening during the yellow time, you can also subtract your yellow time from this flash don't walk to get a more accurate analysis. In this case, I don't know whether they allow it to, so we're going to assume the flash don't walk is not happening during the yellow time. I'm not going to subtract that out. The pedestrian calls per hour, this is data that you can collect when you do traffic counts. So you can have your traffic counter look at how many times pedestrians hit that call button per hour, and you can put that info in. That will affect your analysis, though not by a lot usually. But we don't have that data here. And a lot of times interchanges, especially one in the middle of nowhere, it's going to be zeros anyways. So the next thing we move on to was going down in order on this guy, vehicle extension. This has to do with how much time gets added when you're essentially triggering the detector, right? So 2.5 for our vehicle extension, 2.5. Now, you'll see on that table on the left, it has vehicle extension 2, and that's 0. That tells us we only have 1 detector. If we had 2 detectors, you would have it longer. So you might have one detector that's set at a single car and one detector that's set at a third car, or maybe a third and a fifth. And so what that says is when we've got 3 cars queued, you can add 2.5 seconds. But if we've got 5 cars queued, you'll add some extra amount. In this case, they've got a single detector. It says, hey, when this is met, you can add up to 2.5 seconds.
I'm going to kind of interrupt because we're kind of running low. If
Yeah.
you guys have any questions on what was already described and stuff.
Oh, yeah, because I don't want to keep you guys later. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, please, if you've got questions, the gist of this is essentially going down the line and adding this data in. And it's, as you add the data in, it's going to automatically increase the cycle length. Once you're done, once you have that data in, you check that against what you know the cycle length to be, and you make needed adjustments. So if we know this is going to be 130, once we've added all this in, if it's not 130, we would make reasonable adjustments. Because our model is not the same software that these numbers are written for. It's not always a one-for-one translation. We have to use our judgment to make the appropriate adjustments such that our model will still answer the question we want it to answer. I know I was gonna open up to questions and then I kept talking, so please, questions if you got any. Yeah, do you want me to just keep going down this table until we run out of time, or?
No, I mean, they don't have questions. How he has taken, at least, you get single time plans from that, and they're sometimes different. This is actually, yeah, most of the time given Excel,
Mhm.
and they all come in like tab. So the information still presented the same way. It's just how you input what they provide us into Synchro is slightly different when it comes to depth and phasing, how the phasing is. I don't know if you ever got to how to extract.
I didn't do any of the inputs and outputs. I can talk about that briefly. Yeah,
Yeah, on the inputs and outputs, I would just tell you, it's under operations, that's where you would actually extract, import information if you're giving them single time exams. In the Synchro format. So there's different formats you would have, to have the right things on them. But that's where you would actually have the importing and the outputting.
Mhm.
So if someone's asking model, your model, how do you use single time plans, you would go under the operations and under operations. Save them as the.
Yeah. They call it transfer now. And then you've got this read write. And this is where you do the UTF. And interestingly,
Yes, when they give you the time.
yeah, and it'll specify phasing separately from timing. So you'd want to have both of those, because if you've got timing files and they don't have their corresponding phasing files, it's gonna, the phasing essentially is gonna tell it phase 2 goes to the westbound left, phase 3 goes to this, and the timing is gonna say we've got so many seconds for phase 2, but it doesn't know that that applies to whatever movement. So you need them both together to know, to essentially rebuild the model. And you can even do geometry, layout, those both go into your geometry. And again, they have to be together to work. And then your volumes, if you've got traffic counts, those would go in through there as well.
I just want to add one more comment. They got the building the very smart. Then they get all the turning counts after 5 minutes, and we still need to figure out peak hour. They so how to build that turning movement inventory of database is one of the missing piece in ADOS. They don't have all the counts. They just make engineering job. It's something they don't give a they just give me all the PDF now.
Yeah, it sounds like they're giving you approach volumes. You need to estimate turning movements from that. NCHRP has a tool that they make publicly available that does that. And so we can show you where to find that if you don't already have it. And that's really useful if you've got all of your approaches. But again, that gives you, an output that you then have to check for reasonableness and you can adjust from there. But then, that's all in Excel, and that gives you values in Excel that you can then read into here. Let me show you this real quick. This read volumes. We're not going to see. What you can do is, and Control D also opens this up. You can go read, write, and read volumes. This is one of the most common things we do. It's similar for everything else. If you're writing, if you're doing timings, this is the same screen you'll use. So the first thing you have to do is select your file. It'll show you the file name there. You can go to select, and this just opens up your browser. You choose which file you want. I want volumes CSV. CSV is just a simple Excel file. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Once you've selected, you still have to click read. It's going to read it. It's going to say, hey, it happened to be a blank file, so it didn't read anything. But it'll tell you what it read.
Yeah, so this is our optimization ASU can happen to do a streamline and turning movement data for the different data sources with and then later we will update this UTF file to the 3.0 form or to the consultant. Yeah, it's easier. Otherwise, they just have all they give me 800 single files individually, and all the coordinates are all in the same system.
They want to do really compile.
Yeah, compile what you at least like. Yeah, I want to talk to you in the future. So,
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot more detail you can go into this. you can choose what scope you're gonna read, so which, just like we talked about, there's different zones. You can choose what it reads. But you can also filter limit your records by things like time of day or day of week. So if you even have a single file that has multiple times of day or multiple days of the week in a single file, you can still choose to read just the relevant one, even if it's in the same file. So you would select the file here, specify which time of day. That way you don't have to have separate CSV files for your AM, your PM, whatever it is, or your Monday through Friday and your Saturday.
There is also on peak hour now. Weekdays and there's something which is still.
Yeah, and
It's not a typical 8 PM.
right. Yeah. And when you do have that figured out, you'll be able to tell this guy, read the 8 o'clock to the 9 o'clock or whatever it is. However you determine what peak hour you're going to want, you can specify which one gets loaded